She survived Jim Crow, but broke down watching her great-granddaughter suffer. On the southern edge of Gainesville, in a weathered house with peeling white paint and a porch that creaked under the weight of a stray cat, lived Grace Weston, a woman with hands like cracked earth and a spine curved by decades of labor and quiet defiance. Her house stood just off the main road, behind weed-choked vegetable patches, pressed close to an old building that had once been a school for black children. It was abandoned now, the windows shattered, the boards green with moss and teenage graffiti, the frames rotting and home to birds. Most folks in town couldn't remember when the building went quiet. It hadn't closed so much as faded away, like footprints in wet sand. Grace still woke early, not out of age but out of habit, formed by nearly 50 years of school bells. She would rise before the sun, brew weak coffee, stir in a spoonful of condensed milk, and shuffle to the window. From there, she could see the old field where the children used to run during recess. Now it held rusted washing machines, a broken bathtub, and Jerome's busted-up Chevy. He didn't have space for his junk anywhere else. Still, Grace looked out that way every morning. Where there had once been the shrieks of joy, only the wind whistled now, weaving through hollow metal. A black and white photo hung crooked on her living room wall. 1961. 10-year-olds at wooden desks, hands raised, some glancing sideways, every child black. At the edge of the picture stood a young woman in a white dress with a black collar. Grace. Her eyes held a kind of quiet fear, her lips pressed into a tight line. Most people looking at that photo couldn't guess what she'd been feeling in that moment. But Grace remembered. That was the day a child had written the word freedom on the blackboard, then erased it, not out of fear, just because they weren't sure yet if it was safe to leave such words up for all to see. She opened an old drawer and pulled out a notebook. The pages had yellowed. Ink had blurred from humidity. It wasn't filled with grades or schedules, but fragments of memory. Mary Jean didn't come today. They say her father took her to Atlanta, afraid that after the film screening at the church, someone might burn their house down. Mary read better than anyone. Her fingers knew the alphabet like a prayer. I hope she finds a school where the windows don't need guarding. There were dozens like it, some with dates, others just names and a brief flicker of a day. The words whispered, even in silence. That morning in 1998, the air was thick with moisture, and the porch smelled like wet wood. Grace sat down in her old rocking chair, lifting a light wool blanket over her lap. It held the scent of lavender and thyme. On the floor, her great-granddaughter Elena fumbled with her shoe, trying to fasten it without looking. Her braids were crooked, rushed by a mother late for work. Elena was a good kid, quiet, awkward in that way some children are when they see more than they're ready to understand. Her eyes soaked up everything. Today was her first day at the new school, a regional prep academy, the one that had recently opened its doors to kids from less advantaged neighborhoods, which was the polite way to say black. Technically, segregation had been outlawed for decades, but Grace knew laws were just paper. It was the teacher's tone, the raised eyebrow, the silence at the right moment. Those were what shaped a child. She had seen schools that let black kids through the doors, but locked them out of everything else. No school paper, no drama club, no sports team. And all of it done gently, with a smile. Like that letter Elena's mother had gotten last month. Perhaps your daughter would feel more comfortable in a school with a stronger cultural alignment, it read. Signed, sincerely, Principal Christopher Hardy. Grace hadn't commented, she just sighed. In her time, the letters didn't say sincerely. They said things like, Negro children don't meet academic standards. Or they didn't write at all, just made the decisions behind closed doors and let the rest play out in silence. Elena looked up. Grandma, I'm scared. Grace nodded. She didn't say that's okay. She didn't say it'll be fine. Because she knew it wouldn't be. And because fear wasn't the worst thing. The worst was when the fear faded, Not because things got better, but because you got used to it. That was when something inside began to die. The bus pulled up. Elena stood, backpack slung too low, and walked to the door. She didn't look back. Maybe she didn't want Grace to see her eyes. Or maybe she wanted to look grown. Grace stayed on the porch, listening to the sound of the bus fading down the road. In her mind, she heard the footsteps of other children, hundreds she had once taught, feet on floorboards, feet crunching gravel, feet running for cover when the local boys drove by and hurled bottles at the colored school. Grace knew the world hadn't changed as much as folks like to think. It had only gotten quieter. Oppression didn't shout anymore. It whispered. She stepped down from the porch and walked toward the old school. There had once been 7 classrooms, a teacher's lounge, and a cafeteria that served cornbread and canned peaches. Now it was overgrown, but Grace could still see it. Right there, she had taught the kids about Sojourner Truth. Over there, they had hidden when the boys in the Ford truck came by. And here, right here, she'd once written the word dignity on the blackboard. Below it, the names of students who had shown up even after threats were made. That was her way of thanking them. Her small altar. She found the board. You could still make it out if you brushed away the dust and cobwebs. Broken but still standing. Someone had scrawled a message across it in fresh chalk. Black trash. Grace stared, unblinking, unsurprised. She knew those words never really disappeared. Folks just learned to say them quietly when they thought no one was listening. She reached into the pocket of her old coat and pulled out a worn piece of chalk. It had been there for years. She pressed it to the board and wrote one word beneath the slur. Chapter teacher. Then she stood there a while, as the wind picked up and carried the dust away. Only after that did she turn and walk home. James Madison Prep had stood since 1924, and unlike the paint on Grace's old porch, its white brick never peeled. It was touched up every summer, fresh coats applied like a ritual, covering history in layers of gloss. The name of the school gleamed in cast iron above the main doors, right beneath a proudly waving American flag. Inside the front lobby hung 2 portraits, one of President Madison himself and another of a thin-lipped man in copper-rimmed glasses. The school's former principal, deceased since 1972. Neither of them smiled. The air inside was solemn, orderly. The school prided itself on its strong values and patriotic character, according to the district's glossy annual report. Elena sat in the very last row. They'd put her there before roll call even started. Next to her sat Jimmy Caldwell, son of a local mechanic. Jimmy smelled like engine oil and bad breath, and every time he rubbed his nose, he shot sideways glances at her. Not the curious kind, more like he was scanning her skin for some invisible mark, like there had to be something that made her not belong. His eyes said what his mouth didn't. You're not from here. And her body knew better than to argue. That kind of knowing lived in the bones. It had started on the school bus, when the driver didn't return her good morning, though he nodded to every white kid that climbed on board. It followed her through the hallway, quiet, subtle, practiced, learned from grown-ups, whispered racism. At the front of the room, Mrs. Blanche Hardy scribbled in white chalk across the blackboard. Moral values, respect, order, cleanliness. She placed a check mark above cleanliness. Of course she did. Mrs. Hardy was tall, wiry, hair pulled tight into a bun. She looked like one of those Southern women who didn't just miss the past. They lived like it never left. She never raised her voice, never used harsh words, but her silence carried weight. When Elena raised her hand, Mrs. Hardy turned and called on someone else. When she dropped a pencil, the teacher paused like she'd witnessed something indecent. The classroom walls were lined with posters, Pilgrims, Washington, crossing the Delaware. The word tradition curled across a flag ribbon. One poster showed a photo of the schoolyard. Every child in it was white. Elena stared at it for a long time. Not because she was trying to find herself. She knew she wasn't there. She stared because she could feel the other kids looking at the photo too, and then looking at her. A girl with blonde pigtails and pink ribbons whispered just loud enough, "She doesn't belong here." After school, no one waited for Elena. Her mom was working a night shift at the laundromat. Grandma was too far to fetch her. So Elena sat on a concrete slab behind the cafeteria, flipping through her textbook, the words a blur. Laughter still rang in her ears. Low, private laughter. Her scalp still burned. The kids hadn't taunted her openly. They'd learned how to be slick. Grown-ups had taught them that. The slurs weren't loud. They were tones, glances, lingering pauses, even smells. Then Mrs. Hardy walked by. She didn't stop, didn't look at Elena, but she paused just long enough to place something on the windowsill beside her. A white bar of soap, wrapped in paper. Ivory. She left without a word. The gesture was quiet, but there was no mistaking it. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't hygiene. It was a message. You're dirty. You're different. Fix yourself. Elena didn't touch the soap, but the smell, cheap perfume and shame, stayed with her the rest of the day. The locker room was worse. Old benches, sour mats, peeling paint, and Lisa, skinny, popular, loud, declared it for everyone to hear. "I don't think she should be using the same showers." A couple of girls laughed. One nodded. No one said a word in Elena's defense. Not even the gym teacher, a tall woman with a military haircut, who just kept blowing her whistle like she didn't hear a thing. Elena was the first one out of the locker room, and she didn't come back. Outside, the rain had started, cold and steady. The bus had issues, according to the driver, said the engine overheated, but somehow it ran just fine after the last white kid stepped off. Elena was told to wait for the next bus. It never came. She walked the whole way home, soaked through, shoes squelching. Grace met her on the porch. Her mouth tightened but didn't open. She just grabbed the old blanket, wrapped it around the girl, and sat her down in the rocking chair. She turned on the old gas heater, the one that cracked and hissed but still gave off warmth like a faithful friend. Elena didn't say anything for a long time. Then in a voice barely above a breath, she said, "I don't know why they do this." Grace knew. She'd known for years, but she didn't say it. Because the knowing doesn't help, it just makes you older. That night, after Elena had fallen asleep, Grace opened the old cedar box at the back of her closet. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings, letters from former students, a black and white photo of Grace herself, young, smiling, surrounded by children. She looked at the photo a long time. Then with slow, shaking hands, she placed the bar of soap inside the box, wrapped it in paper, and wrote in careful script. She didn't forget. Grace Walker liked to wake up early. By 6 a.m., the house already smelled like cornmeal porridge, and the radio crackled quietly on the windowsill, catching gospel broadcasts out of Virginia, voices that reminded her of her father. She had her routines: rub the table down with lemon oil, water the dying ficus, set the evening alarm, little anchors to keep the day from falling apart. Grace knew how fast order unraveled when you loosened even a single screw. But that morning, something heavy had taken root in her chest. The day before, she'd received a letter from the school board. "Thank you for your participation in the Community Oral History Initiative. Your memories of 1950s South Carolina will be included as part of our Diversity and Heritage Education project." The paper was smooth, the print crisp, but the message tucked between the lines said something else. Grace could feel it. Her past, boxed up as curriculum. Her pain sterilized and board-approved. She knew all about initiatives. They were like department store windows, reflective but sealed shut. Outside, an old Chevy rattled to a stop. That'd be Walter, the son of her longtime friend, now a corporal with the local veterans group. He stopped by most Fridays, bringing groceries, gossip, in the latest headlines. Walter was a big man with heavy silver eyebrows and scarred hands. Marks from his years at the GM plant before they shut it down in '92 and moved the work to Alabama. Now he spent his time gathering signatures for a memorial to the black veterans who'd served in Korea. There was no real memorial, just a slab of granite by the back exit of City Hall, etched with 17 names, no photos, no ceremony. Grace poured him a cup of coffee and sat him at the kitchen table. He spread out newspaper clippings. Who died, who got elected, who got arrested. One piece was circled in red. U.S. Army veterans honored with commemorative pins. Grace leaned in. Every single photo showed white faces. Not one man she recognized. Not one of the 7 she remembered standing beside her brother in '51. They hadn't been invited. They hadn't been called. They had been told in silence, you were there for the numbers, not for the memory. After Walter left, Grace decided to take a walk. She wrapped herself in her gray coat, tied on a scarf, and clutched her keys in one hand. The air was cool, the sun fighting its way through syrupy clouds. At 6th and Main, she paused outside the old library, now renovated. Glass doors, touch screens. Inside, it was bright and polished. Behind the counter sat a young white woman with sleek hair and a name badge that read, Amanda, Ro, Xum. Grace asked if they had any books about Fort Jackson during the Korean War. Amanda tapped on the keyboard and smiled. We've got Service and Valor, a history of the U.S. Army, but it's mostly about the officers. Or maybe you'd like the children's section. We have a few books about veterans there. Grace nodded politely but took nothing. She knew those books. Grinning young soldiers, flags, parades. No torn overcoats, no filthy barracks. No nights when her brother slept in the mud while a screaming sergeant called him a privileged soldier, even if he was colored. From there, she walked to the park, where a few veterans gathered beneath an old elm. Among them was a man named Ridgely, his coat lined with medals, leaning on a cane, wrapped in an American flag. Ridgely was a walking encyclopedia of betrayal. 30 years in service and not a pension, not a ribbon. Just one bench named after him, and now teenagers sat on it, spitting sunflower seeds. He told stories about how his unit cleaned toilets while the white boys posed with generals, how they weren't given rifles, just shovels and mess kits, and how, when they came home, there were no parades, just spit. Grace listened. She didn't flinch. She already knew. She'd seen it all in her neighbor, Georgie White, who came back from the war and didn't leave his house for a week. His mother had said, he thinks things will be different. Then he steps outside and remembers. He's still a black man in the South. And so Georgie drank, stayed quiet, faded away. On her walk back, Grace passed Elena's school. A banner hung from a second-floor window, the Military Pride Week. Not a single black face on the posters. No mention of Elena's father, who served in Iraq. No tribute to the soldiers buried in the old corner of the cemetery. No flags, no wreaths. Just rusted plaques and waist-high weeds. Back home, Grace hung up her coat and stepped in front of the mirror. A tired woman stared back. Lined face, salt in her eyes. She remembered 1953, when her brother came home from Korea and tried to get a job at the post office. They gave it to a white kid instead. His daddy knew the district attorney. She opened the box she kept in the closet, full of old letters and yellowed clippings. She pulled out a photo. Her brother in uniform, metal shining, smiling like he still believed what came next would be better. She stared at it for a long while. Then she added a note written in her careful hand. We didn't fight for the country. We fought for the hope that one day it might be ours. Later that evening, Elena came through the door. They're putting up community heroes at school tomorrow, she said. They didn't mention me. She'd only seen Becky, daughter of the sheriff, trying on a uniform for the ceremony. Becky didn't have a father or grandfather who'd served. but she had the right skin. Grace didn't answer. She just reached over, laid her hand over Elena's, and said, "We're not done yet." Monday morning came in dull and gray, same as the building itself. Harmon Middle School was a leftover from the 1970s, with washed-out walls and peeling paint that flaked down the hallways like it was trying to escape. The front of the building still read George Wilkins Middle School. But the L in Wilkins had been missing for so long, nobody even remembered when it fell off. The kids had their own name for it now. Viking House. Sounded bold, noble, northern. But inside, there wasn't much pride left in the place. This was where Elena went to school. Grace's great-granddaughter. Same Carolina skies above her. Same long road to class. Just with fewer nails sticking out of the floor than in her great-grandmother's day. Lately, Elena had gone quiet. That heavy kind of quiet that doesn't belong on a 12-year-old's face. She carried herself like something had already cracked inside. In class, she sat second row from the front, beside the radiator that groaned all winter like it was tired of trying. Around her sat kids with last names that meant more than their faces ever would. The builder's son, Baker, the city clerk's daughter, Lawson, the police chief's grandson, proud and pale and already certain of his place. They were all white, all members of the same sports teams, showing up in the same pictures, telling the same stories. One world, perfectly sealed. That day, the school was holding Heroes Week. Parents and grandparents had been invited to come speak about their family's role in American history. It was meant to be a celebration, unity, remembrance, pride. But even in the lobby, the signs were already there. Who belonged and who didn't. The hallways were lined with photos of white men in uniform, medals, flags, sepia smiles. Some families had brought actual relics, helmets, letters, dog tags. One kid stood beside his grandfather, who told the class about guarding a base in Kuwait. "We cleared out anyone who looked suspicious," the man said, patting the combat knife on his belt like it was a trophy. The room burst out laughing. When it was Elena's turn, Miss Crawford, the teacher, skipped right over her. "And next up, we have Jeffrey," she chirped, as if Elena's name had never even been on the list. Elena raised her hand, just a little, just enough to ask without asking. Miss Crawford caught her eye, and in that look, Elena saw it. Irritation, warning. Don't push it, don't ruin the moment. The teacher turned away, kept going. After class, Elena walked the halls alone. The white kids were laughing in groups, arm in arm, talking about whose grandpa had been a real soldier. One boy, his dad owned the gas station downtown, bumped into her shoulder on purpose and whispered, "Did your granddad even get a flag on his coffin? Or they just toss him in a ditch?" His friend snorted. Elena didn't say a word. She clenched her fists. Words wouldn't help. Not here. At lunch, she sat alone. Her tray held some kind of bland goulash and stale bread. On the other side of the room, a crowd buzzed with excitement. Miss Crawford had announced that only top behavior students and those with families who contributed to our nation's defense would be going on a trip to the military base. Everyone knew what that meant. Not her. Elena's father had served in Iraq, but his picture wasn't on the wall. His name hadn't been mentioned. Not once. That night she came home without a sound. Grace saw her walk in, shoulders low like wild grass after a storm. And she knew. Something had happened. But she didn't ask. Instead, she went to the old chest in the closet, pulled out the box with her brother's letters, his medal, a worn photograph of his unit. She handed Elena a faded envelope. "Read this," Grace said gently. "It's from 44. He writes about finding water in a bombed-out village and giving it to the kids. The commander told him it wasn't a combat-worthy contribution." She looked her great-granddaughter in the eye. "That's for you to remember. We always had a voice, even when no one listened." Things only got worse after that. Elena's class was assigned to clean the gym after the Heroes Week event. When it came time, all the white kids suddenly had clubs to run to, or stomach aches. They vanished. That left 3 black students and 1 Latina girl. They were handed gloves and mops. Miss Crawford poked her head out of the office and muttered, "Well, maybe next time you'll participate more. Learn to serve your community." Elena scrubbed the gym floor, bent low with a mop in hand. Around her, other kids walked by with their backpacks slung over one shoulder, laughing, tossing wrappers. One boy whispered as he passed, "Clean it good. That's what y'all are here for anyway." When Grace found out, she wasn't surprised, but something old inside her stirred, something that had survived Jim Crow and refused to die quiet. She went to the back of the closet and pulled out her old suit, dark wool lined with the scent of mothballs and time. The next morning, she walked straight into the school, knocked on the principal's door. They let her in, slowly, reluctantly. She didn't yell, didn't beg, just laid her evidence on the desk, photos, letters, medals. And then she said, "You honor some and forget the rest. But my granddaughter knows what honor means. You don't." The principal tried to explain, tried to hide behind phrases like standard procedure and criteria for participation. But Grace was already standing, already gathering the papers. That night, for the first time in days, Elena smiled, because she'd learned something important. Being ignored isn't the same as being broken. Not when you live in a house that smells like old fabric and strong coffee. Not when the woman across from you has outlived Jim Crow and made sure he didn't outlive her. Grace woke up before dawn, just like she always had. The house was still, save for the wind tapping at the shutters and the scratch of pine branches brushing the roof. She lay there, eyes open, staring at the ceiling where hairline cracks in the paint hinted at ghosts of years gone by. Her joints ached, her bones throbbed with age, a pain she'd grown used to, almost comforted by. But the real weight sat deeper in her chest, where memories pressed like wet cloth, heavy and hard to breathe through. Elena slept in the next room. Her breathing was steady, but even in sleep she flinched. Grace heard it and knew. The girl had already taken her first wound, the kind that splits you down the middle and starts bleeding through your roots. Grace got up, brewed a pot of strong tea with wild oregano, like she used to, and stood by the window watching the street wake up. Cars rolled by, garbage trucks groaned and hissed, neighbors headed out for early shifts. Everything looked the same, like nothing had changed. But Grace knew better. Something was festering out there, an old rot with a fresh bandage. In this new Harmon, nobody said the word racism out loud. It was treated like an old crime everyone had silently agreed to forget. But it still lived, in side eyes, in silence, in sentences like, "We just need you to fit in a little better." After the incident during Hero Week, Elena had gotten quieter, shut down. She stopped asking questions. Even her schoolwork was done on autopilot, flat, spiritless. And that scared Grace more than anything. Because when you start accepting humiliation as normal, you begin to disappear. That Sunday after service, where the pastor spoke about grace and forgiveness, Grace didn't go straight home. Instead, she walked past their block, turned the corner, and made her way to an old building that used to house the local NAACP chapter. The place had been boarded up for years, windows cracked, doors peeling, but in the basement of what had once been a laundromat, there was still a flicker of life, a tiny civil rights center run by a few aging activists. Grace stepped inside. The air smelled of coffee, paper, and dust. Behind a few battered desks sat 2 old men and a woman with eyes like flint. Loretta Walls, the same Loretta who'd marched in the 60s when Grace was just a girl gripping the hem of her coat. Loretta looked nearly the same, only now her voice had the rasp of sandpaper. She listened to Grace's story in silence. Then she stood up, pulled out a drawer, and laid old folders on the desk. Newspaper clippings, school board complaints, reports on racial bias. "If we don't do this," Loretta said, "nobody will. That girl of yours, she is you. Just 40 years later and $40 shorter. And so they got to work. First came the complaint. Grace wrote a formal letter to the school district, laying out the facts: racial exclusion, systemic sidelining of black students, the teacher's dismissal of Elena during Hero Week. She didn't care that they'd likely ignore it. What mattered was making noise, stirring the water. Next came the meeting with other parents. Some were scared, and rightfully so. Many had relatives working in the schools, mortgages tied to banks whose vice presidents played golf with the superintendent. But there were others, people who remembered the blood on the bridge at Selma, who still kept photos of the Birmingham girls in their living rooms. Those folks showed up. They sat on folding chairs in the basement of a Baptist church, sipping burnt coffee and listening to Grace. No one clapped. They just nodded. It was enough. No slogans, just a shared resolve. Grace didn't call for a march or a petition. She called for a document, a full report. They divided the work. Some gathered parent testimonies. Others collected stories from the kids. Someone filed a public records request. Who got picked for contests? Who made team captain? Who got called to the board? Who won awards? 2 weeks later, they had a picture of the school, and it stank. Not a single black student had received a leadership scholarship in 5 years. Not one black girl had played a lead in the school play. Of 30 teachers, only one was black, and he taught gym. The report went to the district's Department of Education. The reply came quickly and predictably. "We appreciate your concern. The administration will review the matter. Thank you for your involvement in school affairs." Grace squeezed the letter in her hand, but she didn't tear it up. She knew. Systems don't break on the first blow. You got to keep swinging. Then came the public pressure. Loretta reached out to a local radio host. He read Grace's letter on air. A small but stubborn newspaper in the next county picked up the story. And then the calls started. Whispers from inside the school. Someone leaked emails. One teacher, a white woman, secretly passed along a training manual. It said to focus on high potential students, and every example kid in the booklet was white. Grace felt herself becoming that woman again, the one who'd once marched with a sign and fire in her chest. Only now the fire burned colder, quieter, not like a blaze, more like acid, eating away inside, but still giving her strength. Elena watched it all happen. She didn't say much, but one evening she came into the room, sat beside her great-grandmother, and said, "I want to tell you what really happened. In class, that day," she spoke, slowly, stumbling at first but steady. Grace listened, took notes, every word, because a child's voice, when you finally let it ring, is a bullet. If it lands, it can crack concrete. Grace wasn't doing this for herself. Her time had passed. But if she had made it through the fire of Jim Crow, she sure as hell wasn't going to let its shadow rot her great-granddaughter's future under some new name like modern values. She was a soldier again. No uniform this time. No drums or flags. Just purpose. So that one day a black girl could look in the mirror and see not a shadow, but a whole human being. Months had passed since Grace, Loretta, and the others began their quiet but relentless fight for justice at Harmon School. In that time, the town had reached a boiling point. Old wounds that folks thought were buried came roaring back to the surface, raw and demanding change. And inside the brick walls of that school, where black kids had long been taught to settle for less, something started to shift. Something no one dared believe possible. The school board had no choice but to call a public hearing, a formal response to the flood of complaints and rising voices. On the day Grace walked into that meeting hall, she felt the hum of tired voices buzz in her chest like the echo of 1,000 ancestors whispering through her bones. The room was packed, white parents, teachers, school administrators, and finally a handful of black families who had found the courage to stop asking politely and start demanding dignity. Elena stood beside her great-grandmother, hands trembling, eyes burning with something fierce and bright. Grace looked at that child's face and realized that everything, the pain, the humiliation, the injustice that once felt too heavy to carry, could now become fuel for a new kind of fight. Not alone this time. Behind them stood not just one generation, but a whole chorus of voices, linked by blood, by memory, by fire. The hearing opened with testimony. Parents who had been silent for too long spoke up. They told stories of their children being overlooked, of teachers who couldn't see past their own biases, of an administration that punished black excellence by pretending it didn't exist. Some of the stories cut deep. A girl pulled off stage for looking too ethnic. A boy whose straight A's were shrugged off while his white classmates were showered with praise. Girls told they had to straighten their hair to follow the dress code. These weren't complaints, they were indictments, and they weren't asking for pity. They were calling out a system that still hadn't learned to see its own reflection. The administrators tried to respond, but their words were hollow. Corporate phrases, legal shields, dodges dressed up as dialogue. Grace watched, unmoved. She'd heard this kind of talk before. It was just air. But then Elena stood up. Her voice shook at first, but it held. "I don't want my kids to make the same mistakes I did," she said. "I want them to be strong, proud, free. But how do you grow into that when the world teaches you every day to be smaller?" You could have heard a pin drop. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. But in that stillness, something cracked open. And for the first time, Grace saw it in their eyes, especially the white folks. Not fear, not annoyance. Something else. Maybe understanding, or at least the start of it. Not long after that day, the school began to change. Slowly, clumsily, but it changed. They rolled out inclusive learning programs. Teachers were sent to cultural competency workshops. The administration finally admitted, on record, that there were problems worth fixing. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. Behind the smiling posters and new mission statements, bias still lingered like mold behind drywall. But still, these first shaky steps cracked the ground just enough to let something new take root. Grace and Elena began appearing at community meetings together. They told their story, not as a triumph, but as a relay. This fight wasn't a moment. It was a muscle, a discipline, a belief you passed hand to hand, even when it burned. There was pride in their eyes, not the loud kind, the kind that grows from surviving the fire without forgetting the pain. One evening, sitting on the front porch of the old house their ancestors once dreamed freedom from, Grace looked up at the sky, thick with stars, and said softly, "I cried when I saw what they did to you, baby, but tonight I cry for another reason. I see you walking forward, carrying our story, not hiding it. You're not just my legacy. You're the beginning of something new." Elena didn't answer. She just leaned into her grandmother's arms, and together they let their tears rise into the night, mixed with wind, with memory, with the weight of generations. They were tears of pain, yes, but also of pride, of release, of healing. Because that cry, that deep, wordless cry, it doesn't just wound, it cleanses. It makes the heart beat louder. Through suffering, strength is born. Through memory, justice rises. And through the fight, freedom. And in that freedom, finally, real change begins.